Well, good morning, everybody, or I guess I should say good afternoon for our morning missives. It's week 647 of quarantine, and hope you're all having a great afternoon today. Jenny, how are you on this fine afternoon? Jenny's still muted. She's learning computers as we go here. But Jenny, I'll ask you again once you unmute your computer. A little.
All right, so I'm a little tech challenged. I apologize. I'm doing well, Drew, and thanks everyone for being here. And I'm sorry morning missives had to start later than usual. Drew had to sleep in today. It's been a really long 647 weeks for Drew.
I did.
But here we are.
Beauty sleep, that's for sure. So we're excited to have a really exciting panel for you today with folks who are really at the forefront of Oregon's recovery. So should we get right into it, Jenny? We ready to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
Perfect. All right. Well, early this year, as it became clear that the COVID crisis was going to be a big deal for all of us, two experienced lawmakers were selected as co-chairs of the legislature's Joint Special Committee on Coronavirus Response. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Representative Paul Holvey. He's from the House District 8 in beautiful Eugene, Oregon, and he served communities of Southern Lane County since he was first elected in 2004, 16 good years there. He is Speaker pro tempore of the House and chair of the House Committee on Business and Labor. He's also vice chair of the House Committee on Rules and serves on the legislature's Budget Writing Committee, the Joint Committee on Ways and Means. Prior to his career in public service, Representative Lee was a professional carpenter, someone we as realtors rely on pretty heavily, and has previous experience in the real estate and construction industries. And he's currently living in Eugene with his lovely wife, Terry, and is running for re-election this year. You don't have enough going on. Oregon Realtors, please join me in thanking Representative Holvey for joining us this morning.
Thank you. And I have the pleasure of introducing Senator Arnie Roblin from Senate District 5 down in the lovely Coos Bay, the Coos as I like to call it. Senator Roblin is a former math teacher and principal at Coos Bay Marshfield High School. I don't know what their mascot is, but I'm sure there's a lot of people cheering down there now, Senator Roblin. Senator Roblin served the people of the Southern and Central Oregon coast since he was first elected to the State House in 2004. Before being elected as state senator in 2012, he served 4 terms as state rep for House District 9. In 2011, when Oregon voters sent 30 Democrats and 30 Republicans to Salem for the first time ever, he served as co-speaker of the House and oversaw many bipartisan accomplishments. Oh, we yearn for those days. As a state senator, he has chaired the Senate committees on education and mental health and has focused primarily on improving the state's public education system throughout his career in public service. Senator Roblin lives in Coos Bay with his wife, Arlene, and late last year, he announced his retirement from the legislature. So on behalf of all Oregon Realtors, thank you, Senator Roblin, for your many years of public service and for being with us here today. I know our lobbyists and our GA team are going to miss you greatly, along with all of the realtors and especially our members down in Coos Bay. So thank you for everything. And since your days are numbered, we know all questions are free game today because you'll answer anyway, whatever comes to mind. So Drew, you want to start it off here?
Well, yeah, so we've got Representative Holvey running for re-election and Senator Roblin on his way out. So they may have different political underlinements for what they might answer. But let's talk a little bit about this Joint Special Committee on Coronavirus Response. And let's start with you, Representative Holvey, if you would unmute your mic and we'll go ahead and get your answer. What have you and Senator Roblin been doing with that? What have been the actions so far and what do you see going forward?
Well, that's a really big question going back, seems like almost years ago at this point when Senator Roblin and I took up this committee. The presiding officers asked us immediately, I guess at the end of the short session, and once the governor had declared an emergency, we formed, the presiding officers formed this committee, a joint committee, with the intent of really trying to look at what our state needs will be during this emergency, this public health emergency, what the economic needs of small business primarily, and low-income families, for starters, what those needs were going to be as we're trying to address this crisis. And that's what we started out to do. We had about 8 days, I think, of committee work, and Senator Roblin and I had a few extra days at the front end of that and a few extra days at the tail end, trying to come up with recommendations with the anticipation that we would be going into special session to immediately get out in front of some of this, which was difficult because we knew the federal government was also acting at the same time, and we didn't really know where monies would be deployed, how much, and to what programs. And so we wanted to make sure that we had an understanding of all of that and tried to fill in the gaps as best we could to put Oregon in a position of weathering this crisis the best that we could. So we came back with a recommendation with several proposals. We had a tremendous amount of public input, which is primarily what the legislature does. We put these issues out, we take in the public input, and we then tried to fashion responses to this and recommendations on what the state of Oregon should do. So that's kind of the big picture. We did not come into a special session at the end of that, and many of those, the governor chose not to do that. She still wanted to get a handle on our revenue and where we would be able to deploy money and where the federal government was going to deploy money as well in these responses. So she took many of our recommendations and actually implemented some of them. To follow up from that, we had some longer term ideas that we were going to explore, but short of having that revenue projection, which comes out tomorrow, and without a defined special session date coming at us, it became very difficult for us to continue that work in this particular committee. Though we did come up with several recommendations that largely were bipartisan, and we think were important for the state of Oregon to move forward with. So that's sort of a general overview of where we're at. And right now, the Joint Committee, unless I'm surprised, will not meet again. The standing committees in the legislature now have time to take on the issues in their little expertise area, as opposed to having this joint committee overall taking it on.
Representative Holby, I apologize. I'm sorry. I'm
fine.
Based on what you made a comment that as this joint committee convened, you did your work, you were anticipating at the conclusion that a special session would be called back in April, or when you concluded your work on the committee. Why was there not a special session called yet? Here we are, end of May.
Well, I think largely, as I kind of inferred a little bit about the federal government's response and trying to understand where those buckets were going to land and who was going to have access to relief, and which makes a difference on where we would put our relief if we wanted to supplement whatever the federal government was doing in the best way we could. We knew it was important that people be able to stay home, economically survive, number one, and that small businesses needed help in order, because they were going to lose their revenues as well. And at the same time, the state's losing its revenue. So those were all very complicated. I'll let Senator Roblin maybe expound on that a little bit more about why we didn't come in, but I think it was largely of just the budget uncertainties of where the federal money was coming, when it was coming, and how the state would respond to those monies and where we would plug in the gaps.
Got it.
And we're still working on that, actually. So
yeah. Drew, did you, or Senator Roblin, did you want to follow up on Representative Holby's comments?
Yeah, I would say that the formation of this committee was very unique. may never have happened before in legislatures. The idea was that we were going to get ready for a special session. And as most people know, special sessions are generally called by the governor. We have an ability to call our own, but it would take 3 and 4 weeks to do that. So it's the governor that can call us in and have a special session. The assumption was that with the emergency going on, we would need to take some action. I think as the governor and her attorneys and other attorneys got together and started to decide, when we declare an emergency, what powers does the executive branch have? And I think they came to the conclusion that they could, in fact, do all the things they needed to do, including implementing a lot of the ideas that came up from ours. So that changed the tenor of whether we're going to have an emergency, a special session. The other thing about special sessions is they are a difficult thing to manage. When you come into special sessions in the past, a lot of work gets done ahead of time where everybody comes to an agreement on what you're going to actually talk about. And you come in for a day or two, you have a few hearings, and then you put out the expectation, what everybody had worked on before you got there, and you get it over with quickly. When things happen because of emergencies, for example, the budget problems that happened in 2002 and 2003, you come in, you stay around for a long time, you don't get much done, you leave, you come back. They did 5 or 6 special sessions. And most people said that was a horrible time to be in the legislature because of the inability to get things done because you couldn't get enough agreement to figure out where you were going to go. So I think what happened in this particular case is previous experience from President Courtney and some of the other people said, we need to start talking about how we can get together. And we had just ended a session poorly. Our short session this last year did not end with a regular sine die and a bunch of bills being passed. And so could we, the Democrats and Republicans, all work together to come up with that idea? And I think that part of the reason that they set up this joint committee and put the people who were on it was to see, could we manage a committee and get people to interact with each other in a professional and courteous way and come up to some conclusions that we actually agreed on as a group. We knew we wouldn't agree on everything, but we could have real conversations about everything. And what we did in that committee was show the public that, in fact, Oregon comes first in the minds of both the Democrats and the Republicans. And this was an emergency that called us to come together and have those conversations. And so with Republicans and Democrats, the lead Republicans in the Senate was Senator Boquist. The lead Republican in the House was Representative Stark. And I think we developed really good, positive relationships. We'd had some of those previously, but I think everybody came up to a conclusion that even though there were other things that both sides would like to have had, the recommendations that came out were the ones that we as a group could agree upon and present to the governor, the House, and the speaker and the president. And I'm proud of the work we did. I'm proud of working with Representative Holvey to develop that relationship amongst people and show the public that we are ready as a legislature when called upon to do our work. The fact that the governor could do a lot of the things and didn't really have the plan for us to come together in a special session resulted in us not having a special session. And there are 2 types of special sessions, and I think people need to understand that. We passed a bill a few years ago. I think Senator Boquist was one of the major persons for that bill, saying that had we had a subduction zone earthquake, that was actually the impetus for it. How could we have government when people couldn't get there, bridges would be down? How do we continue to have government working? And that special session for an emergency can be called by the governor only once during an emergency. And in that particular case, you can actually meet remotely because we don't know if people could get to the Capitol. But it's never been used. We have to figure out if we're going to do it ever. The governor decided only having it to use once was probably not the right thing. So then a regular session, we have to come to the session. We have to come into the building, at least a quorum of both the House and the Senate, in order to have the conversations that you need to have a regular special session. So I think we have been waiting because we want to realize how deep this problem is going to be. And as Representative Holvey said, we have the governor put in a request to cut across the board, which is the only tool she has, all of her agencies by 8.5%, which, because we're already halfway through the budget, I mean 17% cuts for all of them. It's a blunt instrument. She believes that's about what we're going to need to cut for the forecast we're getting tomorrow. And we'll have to figure that one out. So we have our committee starting to have conversations about that as well. So I think there were a lot of reasons not to have the session, and now we'll have to wait and see if we're going to have one in early June.
Yeah. Do you and Representative Holvey, before we get into some of your specific proposals that came out of the joint committee, do you and Representative Holvey think 17% is going to be enough?
I don't envy anybody who's going to be in the regular session next year. I believe that the forecasts and the people who are making those forecasts have a better understanding now than they did before. We do have a fair amount of money coming in from the federal government that can help some of the expenses that we've incurred so far. And so I think that it is the best estimate at the time. So it probably means about $3 billion of cuts that have to be made in the 1 year we have left of the budget. So it is a large amount of money to cut. Something like this we have not had to do. And we had some tough times back in 07 and 08 in the last recession. This one is deeper.
Ooh, well, that's encouraging.
Yeah, that's frightening. So,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you both work very hard on this joint committee. What are you most proud of? What recommendation came out that you feel is most beneficial for Oregonians? And perhaps we'll start with Representative Holvey again. You're still muted, Representative.
Okay, I guess you actually have to hear me. Yeah. Well, I think I was just more proud of maybe not any of the individual proposals, but just getting through the public input that we got through. And we talked about 47 different policy proposals inside of largely in about 8 days. And, and then going through that and getting a bipartisan, bicameral agreement that our recommendations should go forward. So I think I'm more proud of that than I am the individual pieces. Certainly, I think some of our highlights were that we knew that we were going to be struggling with mask and personal protection equipment. And that was one of the things we highlighted at the very front end, though we didn't really have a policy statutory change around that. We just highlighted we need to put some money towards that. We knew we were going to have a lot of needs out there for food, for example, for people that have lost their income. And so many people live paycheck to paycheck. What's that going to look like? I mean, some of those real basic needs at the front end are absolutely critical, to go forward, and recognizing that people were going to have trouble paying rent. We needed housing assistance, so food and shelter were our first, line of defense, I think, with things going forward. So the recommendations that we made around food and shelter, I think, were by and large the most important to start with. But as we got into this, it just kept expanding and expanding of what the needs out there were for small business. The courts got into it, public safety got into it. I mean, it just kept expanding. And so, but largely I was most proud of the process that Senator Roeblen and I oversaw, and just the camaraderie of everybody coming together and working together, having some frank and sometimes difficult discussions about what we should or shouldn't be doing, but at the end of the day, we all stood behind the work. And so
thank you. Yeah, Senator Roeblen, same question. Anything that came out of that especially productive?
I would agree entirely that it was process as much as anything, and it was getting the confidence in all of us, the four caucuses, to have a real conversation and to bring up ideas that maybe weren't comfortable to talk about, but we're willing to talk about. I think that when we first got started, our goal was the immediacy. There were other things that we came up in our conversation that we put back at the end of the report to say we need to talk about these and deal with them in the future. But our deal was Maslow's hierarchy, food and shelter and health, take care of those things. That was the issue that we were foremost. And I think if you look at the proposals, you'll see that that played out throughout those proposals. We wanted to feed people. We wanted to make sure they were housed in the situations that they could be housed in. And we wanted to make sure that we took care of those basic needs. On the mental health committee, we knew there was going to be more mental health. When we closed down education, we knew that the mandatory reporters weren't going to be there, and we didn't know what was going to happen to those kids. How were they going to be taken care of? There are a lot of those issues that came up about domestic violence and a whole bunch of other kinds of things. So we talked about all of them. I don't think there was any topic that was not talked about or people felt, you know, we shouldn't talk about this. It was, let's have the conversation. Let's see what we can do best, but let's always come back to how do we take care of those basic needs of Oregon citizens as this thing gets going. So that was, to me, the most important conversation, and the fact that everybody agreed. And then at the very end, when Senator Finley basically said, you know, we've had a lot of conversations. We can keep talking about this forever when it comes down to those recommendations. But I have trust that the two leaders here, Holvey and Roblin, can go down and sit down and write down what we think it is, share it with us, and then go forward instead of battling out every word. Was a statement that the process had worked, that we had gotten and developed trust amongst the people on that committee, and I was really proud of that.
That's great. So which would lead us into the first, well, not your proposal number one, but how about proposal number two on rent and mortgage assistance, where your committee, your proposal aimed to address the emergency needs of both renters and homeowners who may be struggling to afford their rent or mortgage payments because of the pandemic. So the proposal calls for additional funding for the Emergency Housing Assistance Program, rental assistance, and the Hardest Hit Program, which is mortgage relief, right? So given the anticipated budget deficit, how much is anticipated to go to those efforts? Could the federal funds recently allocated by the Emergency Board be used for this purpose?
So the emergency board money that right now is basically what we allocated was really to spend on the health crisis mostly, and not the economic part of it. We have some real strong feelings about that personally. I think we need to get back as an emergency board and allocate some of the other money and figure out how to spend it. The state and the governor has figured out how to find out what's money and consolidate money from other budgets to make sure that some of that rent relief and other kinds of stuff, plus she's put moratoriums on people. Having a lot of friends who also own those properties who aren't getting rent and recognize they have to pay a mortgage is a really big issue. And we have consistently said we should give the money directly to the owners of the property instead of to the renters, so that it gets to where it's supposed to, so we don't have the foreclosure problem that we had before. We need to make sure that as we do one thing, we don't create a bigger problem someplace else. Those conversations took place very openly in that committee, and I don't know how much money it'll take. It seems like it's astronomical, and it's not the kind of money we as a state have. We don't get to print our money like the federal government does, so we need some help with regard to those kinds of things. And I think as we keep coming back for future e-board meetings, we'll have a bigger conversation about how that other $500 million that's still unallocated can be spent economically to help people survive this process. But I don't think we ever came up with an exact amount of money in our conversations about how much was going to be needed.
So, well, we can let Representative Holvey, do you have an answer, thoughts, comments on that?
Well, short probably on the specific answers so much, but so much of those programs and money, as Senator Roblin said, are federal monies with guidelines attached, whether they're SBA loans or whether they're for unemployment, and some of the other monies that were coming in. Housing assistance was one of our recommendations, and stopping the evictions so people could stay in their homes. But as Senator Roblin knows, our follow-up to that was to make sure that the assistance also went to the landlords who have mortgage payments to make too. And so those dollars are pretty important, and they're playing out, probably not in large enough amounts at this point for people to really see what's out there. I know there's still money out there for those programs, and our emergency board did put money into housing assistance as well. But Senator Roblin's right. We do not print money. We operate on a balanced budget, and we have, pending $3 billion shortfall right now. So it's pretty hard to say where's the money from the legislature, where we're essentially authorizing the governor to spend the federal dollars that we get. And so that's the process. And so without us actually being in session, we can't really, put a lot of fine print in how and how much goes where. We certainly authorize the money though at this point and make recommendations on it.
Can any of that 525 million in reserves out of the CARES funds get allocated to pay for housing?
None of it was allocated at this particular time. It was left in a reserve fund for that conversation to happen next. So it has not been allocated. It has not been, there is no plan currently that explains how it's going to be spent, but it's available for those kinds of things, including help for hospitals, help for clinics, help for small businesses. So there's a lot more opportunity to spend it than there is money in it, but it is unallocated at this time.
And some of that recommendation coming from the emergency board was to allocate it to housing assistance as well. So we've put it out there. It's up to the governor to implement it.
So I'm curious, when you all are discussing rental assistance, is there parameters or a definition on what that means? Is that money that should go to pay their rent, or is that money that should go to assist with utilities, buying food? Because if it's to go to their rent, it does sort of make sense. Just give it to the landlord, right, directly, so we know that the rent is covered. But if it's for incidentals, that's obviously a little different than the actual rent itself. But what's the parameters around that? Does the committee talk about that, or?
We did not talk about that a lot. We did hear from many of our power companies and others that they were not going to foreclose or not going to turn off the power if they couldn't pay it. Everybody has stepped forward to help out in this situation. Banks have been good, especially our state-run banks. All of those organizations have worked really hard to try to figure out what's the best way to put it off. At some point, it's going to come due, and we're going to have to figure that out, whether it's the utilities or whatever. But when we were talking about it, most of the conversation was about rent assistance. And we talked about vouchers. We talked about how do we get that money out in the right ways to get to the right people. And clearly, that would have meant money going to the landlords and keeping people in the buildings that they're already in.
Yeah, and that was the focus. It wasn't to be used for utilities. We had a separate recommendation on utilities and separate pots of money for food. So it really was focused on the traditional idea of housing assistance and making sure rent was paid so people didn't get evicted. And part of that economic burden, of course, falls on the landlords. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't put landlords in the position of not being able to pay their mortgages, for example.
Because once they lose the building, it's not a house per person. So it was very important for us that we have that conversation clearly. And again, as I said, Maslow's hierarchy, food and shelter. Shelter is one of the big ones. If the people are out in the cold, it's not a good deal. We also put money in for homeless to rent hotel space and some other kinds of things. And the federal government's been helpful with that as well, because you need to make sure that the vulnerable populations take care of themselves so they don't spread the virus as well.
Yeah. Drew, I have a follow-up on the homelessness that Senator Roblin brought.
Yeah, why don't you address that? And then we've got a lot of questions coming in from our friends around the state. So let's address the homelessness, and then I'll get to some of those questions.
Okay, so that was proposal 31 of your recommendations that came out of the Committee on Homeless Shelters, which I think you referenced or talked about, I mean, not on this call, but in your committee, House Bill 4001, right, which directly allocated resources to local communities to construct and maintain shelters and navigation centers and so forth. So is it the recommendation of the committee that some of this money be used to take up siting criteria and what the processes will be in emergency special session?
We had that conversation. We did not come to an agreement on that one in particular, or in particular the bills, because basically people said we aren't here to go back to what we didn't get done last time. We're actually look forward to what we're going to do. So we were looking, I think, for opportunities where places would like to have some siting criteria, do some other kinds of things, but figuring out how to do it. Those are more long-term, because building the facilities is not something we're going to get done instantaneously, and we need places for people to stay right now. So, but it was definitely a part of the conversation that took place.
Yeah. Okay. So I would imagine that's a tough conversation, right? You keep
It is
people,
a tough conversation. Yeah.
keep people in their homes, or do you help people who don't have homes find a place to
That's
stay?
right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and we had to do both. And, you know, whether it was securing motel space for the homeless or expanded camps, or we even have, you know, some Conestoga housing, you know, for the homeless that got put up, and, you know, just different ways to try to keep the virus from spreading throughout the homeless population. And you know, we would never be able to get control of it if we didn't have some way to quarantine or some place for the homeless to be. So it was a tough issue.
Yeah.
And we've seen more of that these days, as we've had a number of our listings been broken into by homeless folks who are just trying to find a place. So it's created some issues in the real estate world as well. We've got a great question from Carol Dujois, who's one of our past state presidents at the Realtor Association, just asking both of you about secure notary for Oregon. I personally had a situation where we had a client, unfortunately, who ended up in intensive care during the transaction that they had. And they had to, in order to sign documents with wet ink, as this is still required, have a notary come in to the intensive care unit, and they're sitting there in between two COVID patients. It just seems like in today's day and age, with the electronic technology that we have, Oregon can not be one of the 3 or 4 states that doesn't have this. Senator Roblin, you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, we had that conversation. I have been a firm believer that there has to be a better way to do that, and the electronic filing and the electronic notary is something that intrigues me. Getting it done right is important. We didn't get to a place where we actually got to that done. We haven't been in session, so we couldn't do it anyway. And we know that that's the kind of policy decision that has to happen in the legislature. So it's not, the governor can't do that by executive order. That one has to come through legislature in session doing a bill that authorizes it. So I think there are people who have that bill ready to go if we ever get back into session. The question then is it on the list of those critical things that we need to do in a special session? I don't know the answer to that question right now. I'm not in that group having those decisions, but it clearly came up in our conversations, and it has come up since then as well.
Yeah, it will be critical if our members can't continue to practice real estate in the counties and they can't keep their recording offices open. But so far it's probably okay. But I anticipate that might be a policy that the realtors would support, whether it's a special session.
And it was one of the recommendations that we did get. It was part of our public safety proposal, and also coming from the Department of Justice, from the Chief Justice. You know, also highlighted this need. And being one that actually had to use a notary during this time, I'm going to say it is extremely challenging without being able to do it remotely. So I fully suspect that that will be one that comes up in a special session if the governor has not taken action on that, or cannot take action on it because of the statutory framework around it. It's really important, and that would have been one of the ones that we would have done back in April, the beginning of April, had we gone into special session. A huge amount of support on that from local governments as well, really pushing hard for that proposal. and one that's widely supported by all the legislators. We all agreed on that.
And that other branch of government, the judicial branch, felt very strongly about it. So,
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the judicial branch a little bit. Yesterday, there was a judge's ruling that nullified the emergency orders. How do you feel like the state Supreme Court will uphold that ruling or reverse it, Senator Roeblen?
yeah, I haven't had a chance to read over the whole opinion from the judge in Eastern Oregon. I anticipate that you will find our judicial system working much faster than they have in the past. This is one of those things that they will come together and try to come up with a decision. We'll have to listen to arguments. I think there are arguments when you have special sessions and when you have emergency actions taken that they have a limited time frame. This is a special kind of circumstance with a virus that goes on, and we're not sure exactly when the end date is going to be. So what are the powers of the executive branch in those situations? I think it's probably a question that needs to be answered, and I look forward to finding out what the Supreme Court does. The fact that they took action very quickly to not interrupt what was happening now, I think is the prudent thing to do from my perspective. You know, when we first got into this, I had a couple conversations with some of my Republican friends, and we said, this is a lose-lose for us. You realize that, right? If we do everything that we need to do and we do it right, we'll flatten the curve and we will have a lot of Oregonians who are not suffering because we did the right thing. And then everybody will think, oh, it really wasn't that big a deal. It was like the flu. We shouldn't have done any of this and we shouldn't have destroyed our economy over it. Or we could have not taken action quick enough and we could have had a massive thing like New York City. We could have watched our hospitals fall apart and not have enough respirators and making decisions about who lives and dies by doctors, which was not something any of us wanted. And then they would have said, oh, we didn't take enough action. So you weren't going to win this argument. And I'm really happy that the argument went to the sense that we actually got it under control. Our governor and others took action, which prevented it from going to many of our counties have never had a case. And that's pretty exciting to me. When you're looking at the Midwest now, breaking out in places in rural areas and all the other kinds of stuff, you're watching the meat packing plants. We had an outbreak in a prison setting in Coos Bay, and we had a fish plant up in Astoria. But truthfully, we haven't had the big outbreaks happen except in our senior living centers in certain areas. But in many of the rest of us, we haven't had any. So we've done an amazing job. Our county mental health, our other people have done the right kinds of things, and people have taken it seriously. I just hope, because if we want to reopen knowing this virus is out there and do it appropriately, taking action consistently and slowly is really important. So I'm pleased that the Supreme Court stepped in right now, but they're going to have to answer that question. And I don't know how that will come out right now. I think my indication from looking at it early on and talking to a lot of people is that she does have the power to continue this, but we'll have to wait and see.
I'll go out on a limb. I think the Supreme Court will side with the governor's actions.
Yeah, I think you're probably likely that that's right. Go ahead, Jenny.
Well, how about proposal number 3, prohibiting residential and commercial foreclosures? So we get a little domino effect, you know, you prevent evictions and then we might travel down this road. But if the legislature adopts a prohibition on foreclosures, what impact do you anticipate that'll have on residential and commercial lending?
Yeah, we had a lot of those conversations, and I guess what I would say is that in the last recession, we had some of this stuff happen, and the federal government came through and took care of some of the bigger lenders, and so we got back to where it is. I have no indication that that won't happen again if there is a problem in this market. I think that was during a Democratic regime. This is a Republican regime. I do believe that the belief in keeping a banking system working and making sure that we don't have it all collapse is essential for the country to continue to go. So I anticipate that the federal government and others are going to be watching that very closely. The Fed, everybody will be watching to make sure that we continue to keep lending institutions whole, and we can try hopefully to keep those people who invested their life savings in those things, in those buildings and others as their retirement system, can be whole as well. Because there, you know, we think so often of the big corporation that owns a whole lot of property and is doing all this property management, and them, but there are a whole lot of Oregonians who took their life savings and put it into real estate and other deals, and it is that is paying for their retirement because of their frugal, hardworking ability to take and manage their assets. And we don't need to have a destruction of that their futures because of this event if we can help it. And that's going to take federal money as well as state money.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that, you know, so much of the lending world and the financial industry is regulated by the federal government, and we are preempted in many of those arenas. Foreclosure specifically, maybe not so much, but you're right that, you know, foreclosure moratoriums and forbearance, for example, will, you know, go up the food chain, so to speak, up to those big institutions. And if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are paving the pathway there, and you know, there's talk of forbearance for up to 6 months, and you know, a moratorium on foreclosure for a certain amount of time as well. You know, it's hard to understand who ends up holding the bag on that if the federal government doesn't have money at the top. You keep pushing this up to the lenders, and the lenders are going to need relief at that point. But if you don't push it up to the top, then the person gets foreclosed upon because of a pandemic crisis. And you know, I was talking with some commercial developers, commercial landowners, where the financial industry, we don't see any data to show us that we need a moratorium on foreclosure. But then these commercial landowners and developers are going, well, wait a second, we do. Half of our small businesses are not paying rent right now and are maybe not even going to stay in business at all. And so we see that crunch is going to hit us. So we need to move it up to the lending institutions to take care of, and the lending institutions need to then lobby the federal government and Congress for that relief. It's hard to know, you know, where that ends up. Who's going to end up getting hurt? You know, do you pick one? Do you pick the person at the very bottom and not mess with it at all? And so all your small business and your homeowners then, you know, just are going to lose their homes. I mean, we sort of saw some of that in the subprime mortgage crisis. And at the end of the day, the financial industry did get relief from the federal government, but many, many people lost their homes. So that's a political hot potato. We'll see that probably get some more attention. I anticipated the governor was going to come out with something on this month, though it hasn't happened yet. And it will be a conversation with the legislature, I believe, in a special session, should we come into one.
And I would say that I want to re-emphasize one of the things that Representative Holy just said, and that is that we started having these conversations in our committee, and we realized very quickly that the only group of banks or lending institutions we had any authority over were those state chartered ones. And they are not, they do not hold a lot of that paper. So it became very clear that the federal government is going to have to intercede, because we would have a limited deal, and then we'd be making winners and losers amongst our own people in our state. So it was an interesting conversation to realize. And then we also found out that a lot of the paper is not even held by any of these banks that we consider a bank anyway. They're bundled together and used as other assets in other places. And it got very, very complicated for many of our businesses. In fact, we found out that the way that theirs were structured is that if they even had the money to pay it and they paid it, if they weren't having the income coming in, they were still in conflict with their agreement that they had signed. So it's been a very interesting dynamic for me to understand how the money that's been lent on all of these businesses being bundled and handled across the perspective. That was in the governor's economic advisory committee. we found out a whole lot of things. Paul and I were both put on that committee about restaurants and other people who have mortgages out there that they're paying, and they had the money to pay it, but that would not have met the requirements of the people holding that loan because of the interesting writing of those contracts. So it was interesting information for us.
Well, and a lot of our members are feeling pinched because because real estate is a commodity that they know so well, they may have bought a rental property or two, but they're self-employed, which makes getting unemployment a little bit trickier, which is my next question. And then they also have heard crickets. A lot of them were seen in the comments when they've applied for a PPP loan or something like that. So let's focus on the unemployment side of it. How is Oregon doing? Obviously, there was a crush of unemployment claims, and then there was some money that was earmarked for those non-payroll workers. How are we doing getting caught up? Any hope on the horizon as far as getting through, mainly?
You want me to start, Paul? I will. So that's been a constant harangue in all of the meetings that I am, is how do we figure that out? You know, we got some money from the federal government to update our system. We didn't get that done because we've not had very good success on buying new systems to IT systems. So we have a very old system that runs on very old software, and it takes a lot of time to maneuver. Then the government put in 2 or 3 new programs, and it left unemployment trying to figure out how to hire everybody that knew Fortran and all the other kinds of old languages to come in and fix our program. The last I heard, we were down to about 60,000 of the almost 400,000 cases that left that were very complex, and we had to figure out how to do it. And again, we've hired about 500 extra people in that over the last few weeks. It used to take 6 weeks to train them. That went down to 2 or 3 days to training. So they weren't able to handle the complex ones. So that 100 people that they had originally have to take care of those last complex ones. And then the new programs came on, and it took a couple of weeks to get that figured out and exactly what that meant. So those have been struggling to get up and going. I think we're getting better at that. And I have heard of a number of people who were independent contractors who have been successful in that one. But again, you have to share a lot of information, and that's hard for people because income tax forms, they've got to show that they had some income and where it came from as an independent contractor, and the gig workers, all of those people. So it's been a new learning curve for all of those people in UI to try to figure out a program that didn't exist 5 weeks ago. So I would say they're working as hard as they can possibly work. We kept saying, why couldn't you go 24 hours? Well, apparently the systems at night talk to each other across agencies, and they have to have X number of hours for that to catch up with each other over the nighttime. So they've extended it in 2 hours before and 2 hours later, but they've used up every ounce of time that they can use to be online to process the stuff. The email system, which we were trying to use, all of a sudden got so overwhelmed that was having a hard time keeping up with that one as well. So people are working as hard as they can. I think we are starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We are now processing more than are coming in. So that's a positive example of how those 600 people are working. But we still have some work to do. And if you are one of those people who have been applying for 7 weeks and still haven't got a check, it's pretty daunting and ugly. Even though you know you're going to get the total amount back to when it was supposed to have happened when you get it. But the reality is that doesn't buy the dinner tonight or pay for the rent today. So that's been really hard for all of us. We are on the phone probably more with this particular issue than any other. The only saving grace in the whole thing is that we had maybe the best funded UI system in the country, if not one of the best. So we, unlike some of the other states that are starting to look at almost bankruptcy in their programs, we aren't to that point yet. So that's a positive. But it is this has been the hardest part for most of us in the legislature to field phone calls from hundreds of people trying to figure out if we can help them break into that system.
And I'll expound on that just a little bit. We're actually next week going to have the employment department in sort of an accountability overview of what their process has been and why is it taking so long. I will say that as Senator Roblin pointed out, the independent contractors doesn't fit into the current system of unemployment insurance. Largely, the independent contractors don't pay into that system, and that system is, very nuanced and has a lot of requirements that were troubling. I think the unemployment insurance, the typical one for employees, is working pretty well. There's still a backlog in it because just the numbers, we've never anticipated these kind of numbers of unemployment. But as far as the independent contractor side of this, the federal government gave us money for that, but no guidelines, no criteria that had to be met and how you decided that. All of these cases have to be done manually by hand, one at a time. As Senator Roblin said, you have to have documentation that has to be reviewed. And, that takes man hours with thousands and thousands of people, claiming that. There's also the case where some people were claiming as independent contractors, yet also as employees, or claiming that they're employees, but they're independent contractors. So there was a lot of that was sort of making this much more complicated because people were filing in the wrong category. And so each one of those cases has to be looked at manually and take some time to sort that out just for one person. So, I mean, those are the logistics of it. I'm not trying to make an excuse for the employment department. There's probably things they could have done better. They are working extremely hard. We've got up, I think, 600 new employees trying to process all this, but it is a challenge. The one thing I'll say, the money will eventually get there, but it's very difficult, as Senator Roblin pointed out, for people that needed the money a month ago. It's really, really troubling. We just have to keep working at getting the money into people's hands.
So I'm guessing with the 17% budget deficit, the state's not going to be looking at implementing new software, expense for new software updates?
Actually, we're in the process. They have actually been looking at it, and the federal government is willing to help with that kind of stuff across the country. So getting one that we could actually use would be really helpful. So I think that is something we will continue to look at, probably not until the next full session, but I do think we need to do our due diligence. We have had a lot of fiascos in buying new systems that didn't work very well and cost us a lot of money, and we don't need that to happen in this particular system.
Fair enough.
When you get it all the right information in, it actually works. So that's a positive.
How about
But it has been a challenge in the past to have the revenues we need to revamp all of our IT systems, because they're all antiquated.
Yep.
And the last recession that we had was a big setback for moving those programs, those IT programs forward. Without the revenues to pay for it, they've been moving pretty slowly. But I think this recent experience is going to put this at the forefront again for legislators to consider when we're trying to balance where our money goes.
And the other thing I would say in defense with respect to this and other agencies, the federal government has given us and is giving us a lot of money, which we really need to have, but it's coming in 46 different streams. And every one of those streams has different requirements on it. And making sure you do it right is really important, because the federal government will audit it, and including the UI. And if they find that you've given it out fraudulently or whatever, they ask for the money back. And we aren't going to have a whole lot of money to give back. So doing it right is really important. And in a lot of the money, the money that we got from the CARES Act for the state to spend, there's only one person that's responsible for that. That's the governor. And if you're in Portland or Multnomah County or one of the other three groups, public groups that got the money, the chief executive in those is personally responsible for the money being spent correctly. So it is really, when the federal government gives money, they don't give it to you just to give it to you. They have some tight controls on those kinds of things, and you have to do it correctly. And it makes it much more difficult in trying to figure out how to allocate that money to the right places, so when the audit is done, you don't have to pay it back. So
yeah.
We're
Another
getting
one.
a lot of questions about that pandemic unemployment assistance. Any guidance on receiving it? Another question is it possible due to delays or that Oregon will go bankrupt and no one will get the PUA? How long should we be waiting for the unemployment before we start to get concerned? Can you apply any timelines that might be able to help folks?
So unemployment people told us that it used to take about 3 weeks to get all of the processing and claims done. It's now taking an average of about 5 weeks. So many of it's done earlier than that, but some of it's a lot longer. So that's an average. You've also got the federal government is actually paying the money. So we right now, and we keep checking on that, our fund is in pretty good shape. It continues to be in pretty good shape. When we come out of this whole thing, when they come up and try to figure out what's the new rate going to be for people, that's going to be another conversation that we're going to have. But for right now, our system is pretty solvent, and the federal money, especially for those new groups like the gig workers and the independent contractors, that's fully paid by the federal government. And the $600 a week extra that's coming in is also paid by the federal government. So that money, we don't have to worry about. It's not going to cause us bankruptcy.
The PUA staff was waiting for phones. Do they have those now?
They've been moving into different, taking over new spaces and getting phones. I think that's the last I heard. I think they were okay with respect to getting the number of phones they needed, but they've been taking over other agency phones too. So,
But
So-
but I don't think the unemployment insurance nor the PUA program will cause the state to go bankrupt. We can't go bankrupt. First of all, we have to have a balanced budget. And what happens is we just cut services until our budget balances.
Yeah.
And that's largely from our income tax base. And so as we see the revenues from income taxes going down and those projections going down, we will start cutting services to balance the budget. So bankruptcy is not an option.
Got it. We got about 5 minutes left. Jenny, what questions do you have for our last 5 minutes?
I have Senator Roblin, you co-chaired the Student Success Act Committee, right? So you obviously have a passion for education, as all Oregonians do and should. The outgrowth of that committee was the commercial activities tax. I know your joint committee addressed this as well because cash flow is critical for businesses. So would you consider action to help businesses keep people employed by passing immediate relief from the new corporate activities tax?
yeah, I personally, this is the one tax, people don't like to call it sales tax, but it's the closest thing we have. And it's the one that was probably rebounds the best, which will give money in places that it's needed when people can start buying and selling things again. So from my perspective, I haven't seen one state cut their sales tax. Washington did not include cutting their sales taxes. So I just don't, I understand that it's a problem, and I think it can be a problem. We've had conversations about making it more available so you don't have to pay for the first 5 million instead of the first million. There's been all of those conversations, but clearly I don't see that happening. I do see the revenue department, and they have made some comments lately that have been a little bit better on that one. When they say we're not going to charge you fines and fees if you misrepresent or if you don't estimate very well. Many of these people aren't going to be making the money they were making in the first place, so they aren't going to be having the tax as much. So the economy is going to dictate whether that tax gets paid. When we had the conversation in our big committee, everybody said, well, we don't want Amazon not to pay it because they're making a lot of money right now. We don't want all these other companies that are making a lot of money on this by shipping stuff into our state for the first time who had to pay a tax to help us not pay their tax. So it's an interesting conversation, and I am not going to be there to make that decision because it isn't going to happen until the next session. I do not believe this is one of those that we're going to get agreement on to come into a special session. So I just don't see that happening.
Yeah. Troy, you have one last question for the representative and senator. You both live in counties that have reopened under phase 1, correct?
Sure. Yeah.
So have you visited any of your local restaurants, say the Pancake House down there, or maybe Tracktown Pizza or Sushi Pure up in Eugene, helping out your restaurants?
So we've been buying from our restaurants because they had carry out. So we've been doing that on a regular basis, and we keep in touch with them all the time. I haven't been out to actually sit at a restaurant because I actually check off all the boxes for those people who should not be around other people. I'm over 65 and I have underlying conditions as diabetes is. And so my doctors have been very careful about trying to keep me away from population areas and exposing myself. So we will continue to buy from our restaurants and our other places because we think that's really important. And I do want to get them going. And if I get a chance, I have gone to the dentist and got cleaning and those kind of stuff. I would love to spend some money in take care of myself, get a haircut, do some of those kinds of things. And as soon as I find out if my people are available and I can make an appointment, I'll be doing that because I agree spending money in our local economy is really important. And we've tried to help in any way we can.
Oh.
Paul?
I'll just say ditto. I've get takeout and delivery. I'm a big fan of Mozzie's here in Eugene, so I get some takeout there. Pegasus Pizzas. I like it a little bit better than Tracktown, so you know. So I still rely on them for some of my subsistence. So you know, that's goes without saying. But it's going to be most difficult for I think the restaurant, the hospitality industries are going to be probably the hardest hit, that are going to need the most help. I'm very fearful of many of them not coming back. Very, very difficult scenarios. How do you open up when you can only have half the revenue that you need? The margins just aren't there for a lot of the very small, you know, restaurants. It's going to be really difficult. I hope there's something we're able to do, and the federal government has, you know, more money available to bring some of these small businesses back.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're definitely the most challenged. So everything we can do to help them, I'm sure we'll be doing what we can. It's just this is so surreal to go through this sort of a scenario. I'm still just shocked by the situation that we find ourselves in, both as a public health issue and an economic issue. It's very difficult to figure out where the balance is. And no matter, as Senator Roblin said, we're in a no-win situation. No matter where we find the balance, hindsight's going to say it should have been somewhere else. And, you know, that's why they pay us the big bucks, I guess.
That's right. Yeah.
Tongue in cheek a little bit.
Well, the good news is if there's anything that can be encouraging out of this is that we can get a bipartisan, bicameral work done in the state. And let's hope once things open up that we can prove that can be done in Oregon, again, for the benefit of all Oregonians. And we thank you, Representative Holvey and Senator Roblin, for leading the charge on behalf of all of us here in the state, as well as our realtors. So Senator Roblin, what's the thing you're going to look most forward to now that you're retired and you drop the mic and walk away here with the...
I was hoping that I was going to be traveling to see my grandkids in Maryland, but I don't get to do that as much right now. Or my daughter, who's a playwright in New York, and I've missed a number of her play openings because I've been in sessions, and it's been my big thought with my family is my wife and I can make it to the events that are really important in their lives across the country. So that's what I look forward to. And now it's this pandemic that's slowing it down a little bit, but it's been interesting. Getting on the Zoom stuff has been really helpful. I know my wife now reads stories every night to my grandkids in Maryland by Zoom, and it's pretty cool. They've been going to school by Zoom, and I think the other thing that has been interesting to me is I think the people around the country understand how hard it is to be a teacher because they're trying to teach their own kids, and keeping attention and making sure that they're actively engaged in learning is a really a task that I had the good fortune of being a part of for most of my life. And I applaud the teachers and the others that are going the extra mile to try to help their kids at home these days, and look forward to figuring out when normalcy can return and kids can feel much more comfortable in schools. So,
well, I know Jenny and I both have the attention span of goldfish, so the fact that they're trying to keep children engaged over an internet is pretty amazing, and hats off to our teachers.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think it's in closing, I think I just want everybody to know that I just spoke to a person that I bank with here, and because I'm looking at doing some real estate activity, so a little bit of construction, remodeling, things like that. But they still have money available for small business out there, whether they're SBA loans, PPP. Many of our banks are still processing that, and those monies don't largely come through the state. They go directly through the financial institutions, which you're probably aware of. But just know that there's still an active financial industry out there, and hopefully it bleeds a little bit over into real estate sales. So,
Right.
So you think, one last thing, do you think you're going to be able to get on a plane and travel to Maryland by December?
I think that'll be, I will be fortunate to be able to do it by then. I think the first time it's really going to start being when we get that vaccine going, but I think December is maybe too early.
Oh, it's going to be a long summer.
Yes, it is. Very long summer.
Oh, well,
yeah, we
thank
just hope we can keep our schools open this fall and our
I agree.
university system. It's so critical that people pay attention to the guidelines and try to help.
yeah, it's been rough. Well,
It is.
thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
all your hard work on behalf of all the Oregonians and everyone listening today. We really appreciate everything you do.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the opportunity.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Stay safe.